The New Norm is brought to you by Winning at Home. I'm Steve Norman. Welcome to The New Norm. Last week I was having some conversations with some friends about the Billy Graham rule. And if you're not familiar with the Billy Graham rule, it's a rule that people have talked about being important for pastors and in some cases politicians, where a male person of influence should never be alone with a woman. And there's been a lot of debate about, is this wise? Is it healthy? Does it demean women? Does it create an unnecessary block or ceiling for women to be able to have important conversations with men who are leaders in their church and in their life? And I'm not going to get into all the details today, but I do have 5 thoughts about this. Now, let me start by saying I'm a Billy Graham aficionado, and I like to tell people that I was baptized in the only church that Billy Graham ever pastored. He did not baptize me. He had long since gone by then. But the Village Church of Western Springs was the only place where Billy Graham actually served as a local church pastor before he went on to become a world-renowned evangelist. And if you want more details about Billy Graham's life, I would recommend 2 books about him. The first is called A Prophet with Honor, The Billy Graham Story, which was written by William Martin, and then also Just As I Am, Billy Graham's autobiography. Now, before we kind of pull this thread on the Billy Graham rule, it's important to remember the backstory. Billy Graham was just 30 years old when he catapulted to national stardom. He'd been preaching at the Los Angeles Tent Crusade when an entertainer by the name of Stuart Hamblin decided to become a follower of Jesus. And when William Randolph Hearst, the owner of dozens of newspapers in almost every major U.S. city, heard this story, he sent a 2-word telegram to his editors. And it was this: Puff Graham. And the rest, as they say, is history. Now, in the pre-digital era, newspapers drove the news cycle. And according to, a great trusted news source, Wikipedia, it says that Hearst sold papers by printing giant headlines over lurid stories featuring crime, corruption, sex, and innuendo. So remember, if the only way that people got their news was through newspapers, and newspapers were most likely to generate revenue by selling the most scandalous stories, then scandalous stories sold. Legend has it that when Billy Graham was at the peak of his fame, journalists would find out what hotel he was staying in. They would plant a scantily clad woman in the room and then hide a cameraman either in the closet or outside the window. They were actively trying to stage a scandal around Graham in order to make money and sell papers. I have never heard of this happening to anyone who wasn't Billy Graham. Billy Graham's rule was set up to protect his ministry, his integrity, and his legacy from very real threats. So if we're going to talk about the Billy Graham rule intelligently, it's important to acknowledge the context out of which it was born. So the first thought that I have regarding the Billy Graham rule to people who think about adhering to it is this: you are not Billy Graham. Second thought that I have is this: Jesus did not observe this rule. Jesus didn't hesitate to have a private conversation with a woman in a public place. We read this in John chapter 4. It says, when Jesus came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph, Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. And when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? And his disciples had gone into town to buy food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, you're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. And if you want to read the whole story, you can continue to find it in John chapter 4. But we see this again in John chapter 8, where Jesus engages a woman who's been caught in adultery. They have a very sensitive conversation, a really delicate, pivotal, transformational conversation, but they have it in public. So Jesus had a different view about this than some people in modern ministry do. A third observation: Paul views women as partners and not threats. We read this in Romans 16:3. Paul says, greet Aquila and Priscilla, my co-workers in Christ. In Philippians 4, he says, I plead with Euodia and Syntyche to be of the same mind of Christ. I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers. He didn't see them as subordinates. He didn't see them as temptresses. He didn't see them as threats to his ministry or his integrity. He saw them as valued and important partners in the work of God and the advancement of the gospel. And in Acts 16, we read that when a prominent businesswoman in Philippi, when Lydia and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us, meaning Luke, Paul, and the rest of the party, and said, "If you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. So Paul had enough integrity and enough sense of propriety and enough boundaries to be Lydia's house guest for an undetermined amount of time and not have there be any concerns about lines or boundaries being crossed during their stay. So first point, you're not Billy Graham. Only Billy Graham was Billy Graham. The second one, Jesus himself did not observe this rule. The third point, Paul saw women as partners and not threats. Fourth point that we get from the teachings of Jesus is that the greatest threat to purity is always internal. The greatest threat to our purity isn't coming from outside of our mind and heart. It's always coming from within. Jesus says in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." Jesus says that the beginning of adultery doesn't start with being in the presence of a member of the opposite sex. It starts in our thought life. So if we're concerned in our private world and our private thoughts about the temptations that we're having, that is the point to cut that temptation off at the pass and to intervene. It's a reminder to me that the greatest threat to purity doesn't come from outside of me. It comes in my own mind and in the nurturing and the cultivating of my own heart. And the last thought that I have about this issue is that do not mistake visible protocols for invisible integrity. I heard another story of a pastor whose ministry is falling apart because of a recent moral failure. And while I was sad, and unfortunately I wasn't surprised, because rules don't prevent scandals. Humility, obedience, and sincere accountability do. And you could look to almost any one of the recent prominent pastors who has had a ministry unraveling failing and see that protocols were put in place to prevent them from being in the situations where they would make poor life choices. But the truth is, once somebody decides that they want to jump the rails, no amount of fine print in the employee handbook is going to keep them on track. Now, in all seriousness, it's important for you to know where my standards are. I've been a local church pastor for years. I love and enjoy serving in a semi-public kind of forum and manner here at Winning at Home. And part of my personal code is that just for appearance's sake, it's important for me not to be alone with a woman in a car. But that said, I don't shy away from having private conversations in public places, usually it's a coffee house, with a woman who wants to meet and have a conversation. Now, there's two really steadfast rules that I have around this. The one is that my wife, Kelly and I have been married for 23 years. She knows everything. She knows who I'm meeting with. She knows when I'm meeting with them. She knows the purpose of that meeting. She knows the objective of that meeting. And she always, always, always gets a veto, which she has used probably less than the amount of times I can count on one hand over the course of our 23 years where we've been married. So because she trusts me, and because she believes in the call that God has in my life, we can have open and honest conversations about this. Now, if you are somebody who's want to make sure that you're fully above board, especially if you're a male who's in ministry, my other recommendation, not only for somebody in your ministry and your spouse, if you're married, to know all of the details about every encounter that you're headed into, that's step one. But the other step is that if there's any sort of temptation at all, if you are attracted to this person romantically or sexually, don't meet with them privately. Find somebody else who can do that. But while I have seen some people who had like public independent ministries where I've seen their moral failure or their sexual sin disqualify them from ministry, I've never seen a pastor's sexual misconduct destroy a church. Now, make no mistake, I've seen it devastate marriages and families, but usually, or almost every time that I've observed, the congregation survives. That said, I have seen pastors whose unchecked ambition, greed, or lust for power has ruined more churches than I can count. And we don't seem to have Billy Graham rules for those particular sins. But maybe we should. The New Norm is produced and distributed by Winning at Home. Winning at Home is a faith-based nonprofit committed to making individuals, couples, families, and businesses stronger through counseling and coaching. For more information, visit winningathome.com. I'm your host, Steve Norman. Thanks for listening.